Good morning. This is the third essay or the third lecture about the civil rights movement of the 50s and the 60s. The first two focused upon the actions of the federal government and different organizations. This lecture, we're going to title it A Civil Rights Movement Timeline. And I'm just going to highlight some of the major events of the civil rights movement. I've already remembered the civil rights movement will be an organized effort by Black Americans to end racial discrimination and to gain equal rights under the law. Um, Although it will be tumultuous at times, the movement was basically nonviolent and will result in laws to protect every American's constitutional rights, regardless of their color, race, sex, or national origin. I've already mentioned the 1948, the President Truman desegregated the military, and we've also talked about 1954, the Supreme Court decision of Brown versus Board of Education. Uh, I mentioned in the last lecture about Emmett Till, who was a 14-year-old boy from Chicago who was brutally murdered in Mississippi for allegedly flirting with a white woman. I think the major event that many people remember occurred on December the 1st, 1955. That is when Rosa Parks in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to give up her seat to a white man on a Montgomery, Alabama bus. And her defiant stance will prompt a year-long boycott that we now know as the Montgomery bus boycott. Remember, Rosa Parks will be we remember Rosa Parks before her because she refused to give up her seat, but she was not the first black woman who faced the abuse from white passengers and from white bus drivers. In fact, Rosa Parks had had a confrontation few years previous uh, with the same bus driver. There had been another black woman who was in the same situation, and because of her personal circumstances, the leaders of the boycott did not decide to respond. Remember, the bus boycott was started by black women, uh, and the leader was Joanna Robinson. She was a faculty member at Alabama State University, an HBCU, which is located in Montgomery, Alabama. So this boycott was started by black women. Many of them would be maids who were the ones who were riding the bus to get to work in the white community. The bus cover boycott will last for a year. There will be violence inflicted upon African Americans, and even the boycott eventually will be successful because the Supreme Court will rule that segregation was of the bus lines was unconstitutional. But also, what we get out of the Montgomery bus boycott is this is where you get the first mentioning of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and where he will become the leader of the civil rights movement. I wish I had more time to go in and talk about what happened in Montgomery and why they chose King instead of some of the other preachers to be the leader. All right. Um, the boycott will last a year, and it will end in December of 1956. 1957, 60 black pastors and civil rights leaders from several southern states, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., will meet in Atlanta, Georgia, and their meeting will be an attempt to coordinate nonviolent protests against racial discrimination and segregation. And this will be the beginning of SCLC, an organization that I mentioned before, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Okay. 1957, September the 4th, 9 black students that we now call the Little Rock Nine will be blocked from integrating into Little Rock Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. The courts had ordered that these 9 black students were supposed to be enrolled into Central High School, which was the white school, and the local citizens, particularly the white citizens, were not happy about that. And eventually, and I think I mentioned this in a previous lecture, President Dwight D. Eisenhower will eventually send federal troops to escort the students. However, they did continue to be harassed. The students would go to class, and the federal troops would escort them and go with them. So this will be happening not only in Little Rock, but it happening in other places in the nation. What's one of the points we don't talk about, in fact, I didn't find out until about 4 or 5 years ago, is what happened in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. In Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which is what's called a secret city, was where the atomic bomb was built during World War II, is that there will be peaceful desegregation in Oak Ridge. And 10 miles away from that, there will be a very violent attempt at desegregation in Clinton, Tennessee. So you might hear something about Clinton because of the violence, but you won't hear anything about Oak Ridge because there was not violence. And we think the reason there was not violence with Oak Ridge is because most of the jobs in Oak Ridge were tied to the National Atomic Energy Commission, which would be they were federal jobs, and people were worried about losing those federal jobs, and so there would be quote unquote more non-violence in terms of desegregating the school in Oak Ridge. It was nothing like what happened in Little Rock, and I would just, if you want to know what happened in Little Rock, please go look at some of the old footage from that time period, and especially that one student who did not get the message that they were going to school one day, and the white mob that she had to face by herself, and the bravery she showed, and the courage she showed, and that the local police did not do anything to protect her. There was a white woman who came up and rescued her, and should receive and rescued this young lady. And ironically, as I've said in the previous lecture, many of the African Americans who were the first to desegregate the schools in the South, they really don't like talking about what they went through because there are so many things that happened to them that they do not like talking about. And I saw a woman who was this young lady who was a member of the Little Rock Nine who was by herself that particular day, and I saw her at a convention, and they gave her an award, but all she said was thank you. She did not want to talk about what had happened to her at least 50 years ago. So I saw her on another program recently, and so she is beginning to talk about it. Maybe she's beginning to get some help because some psychologists will say what the African American students face, especially the first ones who desegregated these schools. No, they may not have had to face the violence that would require federal troops or require the police to help them to go to class safely. But they face events every day that worked on them mentally and emotionally. And some psychologists will talk about that they are really victims of PTSD. So 1957, the Little Rock Nine is where President Eisenhower will eventually have to send federal troops to escort the students to class. 1957, President Eisenhower will sign the Civil Rights Act into law, and this law will help to protect voter rights. But as I also said to you before, that to get this bill through Congress will mean that it was a watered down version. But the bottom line is that Congress did get something done. Some people would say the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement really occurred on February the 1st, 1960. And that's where 4 African American college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, refused to leave a Woolworth's white-only lunch counter without being served. Woolworths would have been, I guess, a predecessor to what we would call Walmart. But Woolworths was on a much smaller scale. I'm not sure in 1960 we would imagine a Walmart Walmart and Target and other businesses of that are similar to that. We never would have imagined an Amazon, for example. So Woolworth, like so many of these stores, had a lunch counter. And the lunch counter would be, of course, where you come and get milkshakes and you get a soda. You might get a hamburger or a sandwich and you sit down and eat. But these facilities would only serve African Americans. They were not allowed to sit down to eat their food. In this particular day on February the 1st, these four African American college students on their own in Greensboro refused to leave a Woolworth's white only lunch counter without being served. And these individuals, who are called the Greensboro Four, were inspired by the nonviolent protests of Mahatma Gandhi. And the Greensboro sit-in, as it began to call, sparked similar sit-ins throughout the city and throughout Greensboro and in other cities in other states. I know it definitely will lead spark to one in Nashville, Tennessee. So we're talking about college students, HBCUs, but I want you to understand that throughout this time period, many of these college students will also be expelled. Some of them will end up with uh, since they will be arrested, they will end up with a record, criminal record, and it will be years before some of these convictions and charges will be removed from their records. So I want you to understand how much these African American college students were giving up and sacrificing. So they moved before there was there was no NAACP telling them to do it. There was no Urban League coordinating them. There was no core that was coordinating. This is something they decided to do on their own. And so this is where you could say the masses were ahead of the leaders in so many cases. So many cases, the leaders in many of these black communities were usually the preachers, and some of the preachers were very conservative, as I stated to you before. Don't get the idea that every Christian, black Christian, was in love with Martin Luther King Jr. because one of the spies that they used against him, and that meaning the FBI, will be a preacher. I think he was out of Cincinnati, and who talked about why he was the term I think your generation uses is a snitch. And he has talked about that. He did not buy what King and the other members of SCLC were doing. All right, but I want you to keep in mind. Remember, nonviolent protest was what these students did. That means that they would sit there at this lunch counter. They would have whites cursing them. They would have whites hitting them. They would have whites pouring stuff over them. And they were the ones that got arrested, not the people that were perpetrating the violence upon them. Okay. Okay. Uh, November the 14th, 1960, 6-year-old Ruby Bridges was escorted by 4 armed federal marshals as she became the first black student to integrate or desegregate an elementary school in New Orleans. Think about it. A 6-year-old, sometimes you can still see this photo of a little 6-year-old girl who was going to elementary school who was escorted by 4 uh, armed federal marshals. And her actions will inspire Norman Rockwell's painting. And the name of the painting is The Problem We All Live With. The Problem We All Live With. And in 1964, and you might want to look at that portrait and think about what she had to feel like as a 6-year-old and what she had to go through just to be able to go to elementary school. And a reminder about these pioneers, the ones who were the first ones, what it felt like every day to go to school and to know that there was some armed adult who was protecting you. Throughout 1961, black and white activists, now notice I said black and white activists known as freedom riders, took bus trips through the American South. True protests segregated bus terminals and attempted to use white only restroom and lunch counters. Uh, I know you've seen Greyhound buses. Um, some of you in the class might even remember trailways. Before the airlines, the major mode of transportation, just an important mode of transportation, would be not only the railroads but also the buses. And there were, and with the different bus terminals, what the southern states had done is they had created. Sometimes they had separate waiting rooms for black and white. They had separate restrooms for blacks and whites. They had separate lunch counters. They had separate bus terminals. And eventually, in I think it was 61, the Supreme Court said that is unconstitutional. Unconstitutional. And so some black and white activists decided to test, to get on buses in the South and to ride together, uh, to not worry about anything that said white only or colored only. Black people would go into the white facilities and they would sit at the lunch counters that were supposed to be for the opposite race. So they were testing. They decided to test and to see if the South was going to obey the law. And the reason I can say the South is because the Freedom Riders started in, I think they will experience violence in Tennessee. They will definitely experience violence in Anniston, Alabama, and in Jackson, Mississippi. And they were called the Freedom Rides. And the Freedom Rides will be marked by horrific violence from white protesters that will draw international attention to their cause. And the ones who will suffer physically, will be black and white. The white uh, protesters did not have any problem using the N word or N lover, and anyone white that was involved in this, that's what they were, the way they were viewed, that's the way they were treated, and there will be whites who will, as a result, uh, be beaten and severely for their participation on the Freedom Rides. In 1962 was when the courts will order the desegregation of the University of Mississippi. The result in Mississippi will be the governor uh, standing in the way and permitting, prohibiting James Meredith from enrolling at the University of Mississippi. Uh, Eventually, what will happen is there will be 2 or 3 nights of violence. The violence will once again will be whites, not black people. Will be whites, and I think there will be 2 people that will be killed to desegregate the University of Mississippi. And the governor's name was Ross Barnett, and he will build his political career on being willing to stand in the doorway and to keep James Meredith out of Mississippi. And as I said, there will be violence that weekend because of that. 1963, of course, in 1963, you will have, first of all, you will have the bombing at the church, the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, where 4 little girls, black girls, were killed in church. Uh, Remember, there was a 5th one. She was not killed, but she is now being remembered, being recognized, and she is now speaking out. Uh, Her sister was one of the 4 that was killed, but as I stated, this young lady was not. Uh, she will lose sight in her right eye, and of course, there will be other lasting physical injuries, not only in addition to the mental and emotional injuries that she will suffer for the rest of her life. And part of it is, of course, people forgetting that there was a fifth victim. And she may not have died, but too many people only think that there were, just remember the four that were killed and don't remember the one that had to live what had transpired. And eventually, the ones who will commit this heinous act will be convicted. Uh, and that in itself is a story. But, and then also when we talk about what will happen in 1963, this will be when Martin Luther King Jr. and uh, and that would be September 15th. 1963 will also be when the SCLC will institute a campaign in Birmingham to desegregate Birmingham. Birmingham had a reputation. It was called Bombingham. Bombingham. And I think I've talked about this in class, and this is where King will use the strategy where uh, kids will get out of school and march uh, to downtown Birmingham, and the kids will be saying, "What do we want? We want freedom. When do we want it? We want it now." And the kids will be attacked by police dogs and fire hoses of the police uh, under the leadership of Eugene Bull Connors, which is who was to me had to be an evil man for all he did. Okay, so there was a lot that went on in Birmingham, but also what went on in 1963 is 250,000 people took part in the March on Washington, the March on Washington for freedom and for jobs and freedom. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. will give his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, and that will be the closing address in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And of course, there will be other speakers besides King. We also know that John Lewis will speak. It's interesting. Uh, they had to edit John Lewis's speech because there was there was at least one line in particular that bothered John F. Kennedy, and I'll let you do some research about that. But it's just, you know, it's interesting how he was considered radical because of one statement or one sentence that he had in the speech, but yet by 2020 he was considered a statesman. I guess it's a reminder about what happens to us with age. And there were, like I told you, there and other lectures there were other speakers also. And and when we now know with the closing with Dr. King, the closing that he gave was not the closing that he had written. He had another closing written, but he ad libbed, and we now know that it was because Sister Mahalia Jackson was in the audience. She had sung at the event, and she told him, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." And that's where he told him about the dream, that I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self evident that all men are created equal. So, um, if you hear that story, it is true that there was another ending that the king decided not to use, and seemingly it was at the urging of Mahalia Jackson. Now, how did she know about it? I don't know. I guess they may have talked about it. So I'm not sure, but that's where he made the change, and that's part of what we now remember about his speech. Okay. 1964, 1964. We also know that um, that's where President Lyndon Baines Johnson will sign the Civil Rights Bill in 1964 into law. This will prevent employment discrimination due to race, color, sex, religion, or national origin. And it will also establish the United States Equal Opportunity Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, to help prevent workplace discrimination. You will also get in 1965, you will get passage of a constitutional amendment. The constitutional amendment will make the poll tax, which had been used to keep African Americans from voting, they will make the poll tax unconstitutional. Also, what you will get in this time period is this is when you will have the Freedom Summer in Mississippi. The Freedom Summer in Mississippi. And this is where when black and white, especially college students, once again, will go into Mississippi to try to register African Americans to vote. And if you know anything, remember anything about your history, this is where you'll remember the three boys who were killed. Two of them were white, one was black. Swerner, Cheney, and Goodman, and they were killed. And the FBI and the federal government will do a search for days to find their bodies. I think there is a movie called Mississippi Burning, which gives a fictional account of the search for their bodies. And notice I said fictional because J. Edgar Hoover was no friend of the civil rights movement. He was definitely not a friend of Martin Luther King Jr. And remember, in the process of looking for the bodies of these three civil rights workers, these three young men who only were trying to help black people to vote, in the process of looking for their bodies, the authorities will find the bodies of other African American men that have been missing for years, but there had not been any publicity. And of course, none of them had been white. And there's a strong feeling, and I think the historical record backs it up. Part of the reason the FBI and the federal government was so intent to find these three young men is because two of them were white. And remember, they will not be the only whites who will lose their lives for the civil rights movement. There was a mother, a white mother from Detroit, Viola Luiso, who will be killed in Alabama, transporting African Americans, African Americans who were trying to get people registered to vote, and she will be killed. And there will be be a white minister, Unitarian minister, who will be killed in Alabama. And to my knowledge, I'm not sure that their perpetrators or the ones who perpetrated the violence against them were ever brought to justice. Now, some would say it's not necessarily civil rights, but it's a civil rights, an important black leader. Let's put it that way. And black religious leader Malcolm X will be assassinated on February the 21st of 1965. He will be assassinated during a rally by members of the Nation of Islam, but we now feel that these members of the Nation of Islam who did serve time were doing it at the behest of members of the federal government. And we'll talk about Malcolm, hopefully get talk about Malcolm more when we talk about the Nation of Islam. And we hope to do that before class ends. March the 7th, 1965, Bloody Sunday, the Bloody Sunday. That will be in the Selma to Montgomery March. Around 600 civil rights workers were going to walk to Selma, Alabama, to Montgomery, Alabama, the state's capital, to protest black voter suppression. Local police blocked and brutally attacked them. The first one to fall will be the late Honorable John Lewis. And eventually, after successfully fighting in court for their right to march, Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders will lead two more marches and finally reach Montgomery on March the 25th. Yes, there was Bloody Sunday, but then there was also what was called, I think it was Turnaround Thursday, where they started the march, but they turned around. But eventually they got there. And Bloody Sunday on March the 7th, 1965 will help lead to August the 6th, 1965, when President Lyndon Johnson will sign the Voting Rights Act to prevent the use of literacy tests as a voting requirement. It also allowed federal examiners to examine voter qualifications, and it placed for federal observers to monitor polling places. There were other events that will occur, but I guess some people would say the end of the civil rights movement will occur on April the 4th, 1968. This is when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on the balcony of his hotel room in Memphis, Tennessee. And James L. Ray will be convicted of his murder in 1969. There are still, this may be one of the early conspiracy theories. There are still a lot of people who do not believe that James Earl Ray was the assassin. Um, because Martin Luther King Jr. by 1968 had lost a lot of his popularity because he and Lyndon Baines Johnson and others did not agree about the March on Washington. As I've always said to you, I think when you look at history and you look at individuals, remember, uh, quite often people change. They change. The Malcolm X of 1963, while he was in the Nation of Islam, was not the Malcolm X of 1965. The Martin Luther King Jr. of 1963, who gave the I Have a Dream speech, was not the Martin Luther King Jr. of 1968 when he was assassinated. Uh, they changed. One, I think you could see with Malcolm, maybe Malcolm became, uh, he moved away from the Nation of Islam that some would say had a strong dislike of whites to a viewpoint after going to Becca. He found out Muslims could be of any skin color, any hair shade, and he saw the commonality. But he did feel that in America, that there were still problems with race. But I'm not sure he bought the idea of separatism as the solution anymore. With King, I think King will 1963. The focus was upon changing the laws, change the segregation laws, and I think by 1968 he came to the conclusion that changing the laws was not going to be enough. That there had to be some changes within the system. That does not mean a revolution, but did mean that there had to be some changes within the system. And so on April the 11th, 1968, for 7 days after King was assassinated, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1968, also known as the Fair Housing Act, providing equal housing opportunities regardless of race, religion, or national origin. So I'm a firm believer if you're going to have to pick an end to the civil rights movement, it's 1968. Because what will happen afterwards is what I would call the Black Revolution. And the next lecture, and maybe the last one for this class, I'm going to focus upon that. And for the article that you're writing the essay about, you will find that black students who were going, uh, they were taking an attitude, they were having a different attitude about what it meant to desegregate or to integrate. And that is what began to show up in the 1970s. I think in the 1970s, you'll see, as with my article that I'm letting you read and Smith's article that you're writing about, that African Americans are going to focus upon we want to be whites, be with white. Wow, we want to be with whites, but we did not want to be white. Let me say that again. We wanted to be with whites in terms of going to school and getting equal opportunities, but that did not mean that we were going to give up our culture, our history, our heritage. We were still black, and we were going to be proud of being black. And so that sets up, I think, an issue that we talked about in this class. Sometimes it's what does it mean to be black? What are we trying to achieve? Is it integration, desegregation, assimilation, or culturalization? All of those questions that I guess you can still have fun trying to answer when this class is over. All right, take care. Have a good day. Bye.